But there's also something beyond the desire for reality to know what's true. And this last orientation is really, really probably the most important part of spirituality, because it informs all levels of a spiritual teaching, all levels of truth realization. And that is the orientation, the general orientation of all these teachings is basically the surrender of self. And it's the surrender of self that is alive and an active part of every single part of these teachings that I've presented. All of them are different ways to surrender self, to surrender our idea of ourselves, our notions of ourselves. Whether that teaching has to do with stillness and silence, meditation, whether it has to do with inquiry and questioning and a deep probing of what we have imagined to be true, what we've held on to, what we tend to hold on to very tightly, or any other aspect of the teaching. The atmosphere in which all these teachings exist is an atmosphere of surrendering of self. And when I'm talking about self, I'm talking self with a small s, you could say. Now, self is a very difficult thing to define. And it's not initially even important to have a clear definition of self. What's probably more important is to have a sense of one's own ego structure, of that within oneself that is at odds with existence, that is always wanting and desiring and craving, and then it's also simultaneously pushing away and resisting and avoiding. Those are the two movements of ego, to grasp and to push away, to grasp and to push away, to grasp and to push away. Ego, you could say, is ego is another word for, we might call it lower self. The lower self is really ego. It's where we're dealing with more of the base instincts of self, and these are what we think of as egoic instincts, for control, for power, for dominance, for the ego, all the traits that egos tend to involve themselves in, the wanting for attention, the tendency to get stuck in a blaming energy, a condemning energy, the identification with being victim. I think if you really look at the nature of ego within yourself, you could come up with your own ideas, your own experience, which is really more important, of the way ego moves within you. But generally, ego is that which is grasping and pushing away. So the underlying structure of ego is it's really a type of will. Underlying ego is a type of will. I want and I don't want. So attachment and aversion these are easy words to use, but what is attachment and aversion really like inside? And inside it's a movement of will. It's a movement towards or away, this constructs or is the foundation of ego in the context that I'm using it in. Spirituality is really, as I said, all of the various teachings are different means, are different approaches of surrendering self. Now, there's a tremendous amount of confusion about what surrendering self means. And this is something that's important to have some clarity about. What does it mean to surrender self? Because a lot of people, they will engage in a sort of a false surrender, which a false surrender is the kind of surrender we do in order to not have to take responsibility for ourselves, for how we feel, for what we think, for our lives in general. And it's a false surrender. It's sort of like this way of copping out. It's a way of trying to let ourselves off the hook. But that's not a real surrender. That's a way of dealing with the problem of ego by denying it. A real surrender is really seeing each way that we hold on, that we grasp, that we try to control, that we try to dominate, in very overt ways and also very, very, very subtle ways. And it's the intention to let that go, to surrender. Now, very few people can actually simply surrender. Mostly we surrender when we are in a deep enough state of suffering. So the teachings are ways or tools to help engender surrender. The surrender of self. The surrender of self. That is what spirituality is all about. That's the whole orientation.